Hello, and welcome to Transition Tea, the podcast dedicated to demystifying the world of transition and activation planning. I'm your host, Christina Oliveria, Director of Business Development and Communications of Yellow Brick Consulting. Today, I'm really excited to have Adrienne Haynes, the Associate Director of Design and Construction at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, joining us today. Adrienne, thank you so much for agreeing to be on this podcast and welcome.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you for inviting me. This is a first for me. So, introduction to me. Well, I'm an architect by profession, as well as a clinical lab scientist. I've been at Cedars-Sinai since, 1989. I've been with facilities planning since 2000. And, I'm a native Los Angelino and loving life.
Well, we're really excited. We've had the pleasure of working with Adrienne for many years today. Adrienne and I both have our cup of tea ready. I'm drinking the Spice is Life by David's Tea. And Adrienne, I think you're drinking a really good tea too.
I have a ribose, and it is an herb tea from South Africa. And I was introduced to this tea back in 2016, my first trip to the Netherlands. And I was served the tea, and I've been hooked ever since. So it's very good.
So, Adrienne, you kind of gave a preview of your background, but you've had a really fascinating career journey. You've done multiple things in your career history, and I'd love for you to share just a brief description of your road and how you've gotten to where you are today.
Goodness. Well, it's not that exciting, but the reality is I started out as a healthcare professional. My Bachelor of Science degree is in microbiology and clinical lab science. From graduating from Cal State LA undergrad, I went into med tech training, and I sat for my license. And I actually did that for 20 years, or nearly 20 years. I spent the first 7 years at a small hospital in Culver City. I was a bench tech. I was in every department. It was a small 200-bed facility, and I did everything from microbiology to cross-matching blood, to hematology, chemistry, you name it. Drawing blood when I had to. I've had a few interesting stories about that. And I did that for 7 years at a small hospital. And then in 1989, I moved over to Cedars-Sinai. And I worked in the pathology, in microbiology, much bigger facility. So I wasn't all over the place. I wasn't working in multiple departments, but I worked exclusively in microbiology for 12 years. And then at that time, I decided I wanted to do something different. And I got kind of pulled into interior design. I thought I wanted to do interior design. I took a couple of courses over at UCLA, and two courses led to a dozen. And I decided, let me put a portfolio together and apply to architecture school. And I really wasn't sure if I'd get in, but I did.
Wow.
So I got my master's in architecture from Cal Poly Pomona in 1998. When I finished, I was not a child. I went back at age 37. I finished at 41. And I completed my license. I'm fully licensed architect with the state of California. I completed my license in 2008. So, it's been an interesting journey, but I managed to marry healthcare and design. Originally, I thought I wanted to go off and be another Frank Gehry or Erico and Moss. And I said, let's be realistic. You're 41. You have a house note, a car note, and responsibilities. Let's stick with what you know. And I stuck with healthcare. So, I thought I was leaving Cedars. I ended up applying to their facilities planning, and they practically hired me on the spot. And that was in 2000, and I've been there ever since.
You went from one completely specified, the lab is so complex, to another area. And I just thought that was so incredible. And I thought it was a fun fact that I also went to Cal Poly Pomona.
Yes. Wonderful school.
I love that. I'm hoping my so the lab, super complex environment, probably one of the most complex to activate. in terms of a new healthcare facility. So I wanted you, given your background, to provide an introduction to the laboratory space and a summary of some of the hot topics that people need to be aware of when activating this type of space.
Oh gosh. So activating a lab, I think the most important thing to understand is the difference between a research lab and a clinical lab. I never worked research, but I'm familiar enough with the research capacity, and it's a very different animal. They are not working on specimens from patients who are either in treatment of some sort or actually inpatient. So it's very different. When you activate a clinical lab, you are handling specimens from patients who are waiting for results, sometimes so they can go home. So they need some discharge labs. So everything is stacked, everything is moving constantly, and clinical labs cannot close. I think a lot of people don't realize that, if you're moving in administrative space, you pack up, you shut down for a couple of days, you move over a weekend, and you set everything back up again. But with a clinical lab, you can't do that. Because of the requirements with agency, you have to move in phases. And it's a very painful process, actually, because at some point you're having your staff in two different locations, and half your lab is in one space and half your lab is in its original space. Because when you move specimens over and instrumentation over, you have to do QA/QC, and you have to do parallel testing and validation before you can move the other half of the lab over and then get your licensing. So it can be rather daunting depending on what you're doing, what type of lab it is. And I think part of the challenge is sometimes, for example, a lab will have one analyzer. I mean, this may be in a smaller lab, or something specialized. When it's time to move, how do you move the one analyzer? Sometimes you have to buy a second. You buy a new one, it goes to the new site, it gets QA/QC, it gets parallel tested. And when it finally is up to snuff, then you move the old one, or the old one goes away, and then you move. But imagine doing this 100 times. Currently, I'm on a project where we're moving 130,000 square feet of lab, about 10 different departments. And we have this case multiple times. So it can be extremely complex, and everybody needs their own time. I went through this with a smaller project. One department wanted 3 months for QA/QC and validation. The other department wanted 3 weeks. So you have to work with everybody in their own timeframes. So it can be very complicated.
Yes, absolutely. And I love how you alluded to, that cutover period being so different than a patient care environment, because
Right.
you have the luxury, for example, a patient move, we're going to cut over in a single day, and then voila, we're open and the other place is closed. But for a lab, the lead time is so much greater. And
Yes.
all those, I think, predecessor tasks really need thought out ahead of time. So you summarized them so perfectly. And I know, just working with you and having had an experience of opening, a single department lab, it is certainly a lot of work. So
it is. It really is. It really is.
So from the lab, then architecture, and now managing a portfolio of projects for a major healthcare institution in America. Lot of different types of work, but I imagine some similar skill set that you need for all three. Can you share any of those, common thread elements that you have found to be, essential to doing your job?
I can remember as a teenager and junior high, some people say I always wanted to be X, Y, and Z. I always wanted to be, I know I never wanted to be in a hospital. How did I end up in one? I never wanted to work in a hospital. I remember as a teenager, I tripped, I stepped in a hole, and I thought I broke my ankle. It was just a really bad sprain. And I remember sitting in the emergency room with my mom, and the gurneys are going by, and I'm just like, I never want to be in a hospital, right?
Yeah.
I ended up in a hospital anyway. And one of the things that I'm glad I didn't hold on to that, very immature point of view is I have been able to, even though I worked in pathology in the laboratory, I understand the culture. I understand the stresses and the areas of importance when it comes to a healthcare professional and what they go through just trying to do their job. I've had this conversation with architects, even my own boss. I said, just because it's pretty doesn't mean it works. Sometimes it has to be less than beautiful for them to be happy. And a lot of times they don't understand that. So I'm able to really explain to them why pretty isn't always the best. It's got to be what works for their workflow. So that's been a kind of a battle, but I think it's also been an advantage because a lot of our users love working with me because I get it. I get, how difficult it can be to do their job. And, somebody had this grand idea to put something over here and to put something else over there because it looked good, but it's not necessarily the most efficient. So those are the types of things. I think that's what helps me is the fact that I have spent 40 plus years in healthcare in one capacity or another. So, yeah.
Are like they're and able to probably translate and advocate for a more functional program versus, to your point, something that's beautiful, that looks fantastic, but ultimately does not serve the end user as well as they would like, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that has really helped me a lot. And it has caused some, disappointment on some designers, on their behalf, but you got to do it the right way. You have to do what's going to work for the staff and for the institution. So that's where it's
These
benefited me.
projects are investments. They're not,
Yes.
of a dime. They're
Right.
very costly. So you want to get it right. You want to give them something that can last many, many, many years, and that you have to the drawing board
Yes.
a couple years and say this didn't work. So
Yeah. It can be a challenge because so many things change. I just had a similar conversation with two of my bosses, and we were talking about how molecular pathology has grown. I recently, 10 years ago, I moved microbiology and molecular to where they are now. Micro was huge, molecular was a subset. It's starting to flip. The technology and the science has changed. Molecular is growing. In fact, they've had to send out their parasitology so molecular could take over that little piece of the lab. They're growing because technology has changed. So sometimes, no matter how hard you try to get it right for a long, long period of time, things change and you have to upgrade. So the key is to try to make things as flexible as possible so they can grow, so they can move things around, they can take things out, or they can reconfigure what they've got. Easier said than done. It's not always possible, but that right now, especially with technology changing so rapidly, you've got to make those changes. You've got to make those changes and also pay attention to, if you're going to be in a space for 20 or 30 years, how is that space? And your walls are fixed and finite. Your space is limited. How can that space grow without actually gaining more square footage? So,
wow, this is so. We get some questions, but I have to share, Adrienne. I just wrapped up a course through ASHI, and they were discussing design. Is that this program is typically designed, and then it takes multiple years, correct, to build this program.
yes.
What you intended at the start may not be what it's used for at the, and so that ability, to your point, to be flexible, especially because, specification for technology, equipment, etc. This equipment is constantly needing new data.
Changing.
All of this is so complicated that a version that it was built for, in, for example, this year and is not going to be used till 2024, Maybe.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you have those conversations?
How do you have those conversations? It's tough because um, when I sit down with some of my users, I ask them to think in the future. Okay, tell me about that conference that you went to where they had the vendors on the floor and now you're trying to get your leadership to give you approval for a budget for new equipment. What direction is it going to? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years, which is kind of hard, but 5 years is about the most you can go. What does the future look like? And sometimes you can accommodate it and sometimes you can't, or you just do your best to make the space as flexible as possible. So I think what's interesting about pathology and laboratory medicine is, I'm dating myself. When I, first started, identifying a microorganism was through a series of biological reactions, biochemical reactions. I had a rack, I had a bunch of tubes, and you inoculate the tube, and you look at the results of the tube, and you reference it to a chart, and gram stains and morphology and way it looked on a plate. Oh, okay, it's E. coli. Oh, it's Pseudomonas because it had. Okay, we don't do that anymore. By the time I left the lab, it was a little card with a bunch of little uh, capsules on it where you injected a solution of the microorganism and you put it in a machine and it popped out 24 hours later. Okay, the results. Okay, it went from that. Now it's molecular. Now they don't even bother with biochemical reactions. With maybe a few cases, you would include some biochemical reactions, but now it's all about DNA and RNA sequencing. Oh, this is the sequence. Oh, it's Pseudomonas. Oh, it's, Staphylococcus. But what's interesting is you go from a rack of tubes that sits on your desk to a piece of equipment that's the size of a minivan. It's huge. And I have yet to understand. Now I haven't actually worked in the lab since 2000, because all through architecture school, believe it or not, I work weekends and the summers in pathology. I know I was crazy, but I, got bills to pay. You do what you got to do, right? So, but I mean, it went from, a rack of tubes to this thing that's, 20, I won't say 20 feet, 6-7 feet long and 30 inches deep. And it's, it's got all these robotic things going on. And it's incredible. It's just incredible. Incredible. Yeah. So.
Well, shifting gears to projects. You've done, I don't even know how many projects with just us. So I imagine your portfolio is huge when it comes to project management. Can you share perhaps your most memorable lesson learned from a project you worked?
Wow. So, wow. A lesson learned from it's kind of hard to pick just one. Okay. I've done a wide variety of imaging projects, emergency rooms, ORs, administrative spaces, gardens. I did the healing garden that's on the plaza level at Cedars. I think in general, and this is probably a pretty standard lesson, but trust but verify.
Before. So
I always, sometimes you just have to see it for yourself. And granted, if you're very, very busy and sometimes you can't check everything, but I trust, but I verify. And I can't pick out one particular project, but it's something that I learned painfully early on. It's like, but they told me they did it. Not really. So yeah, I'd have to say just in general, trust but verify.
We share that with clients all the time. Adrienne's familiar, but we go through a go, no go process, right? And we say something's complete, go, it's ready. But until you see it,
Yeah.
really hard because people are waiting for that information to truly be done. What does done mean? Done is it's in the space, but is it programmed? Is it integrated, et cetera? So I definitely like that one. Track and then verify. Very
Yeah.
uh, so we touched on frontline clinical staff engagement in design, and it's really become less of a nice to have in recent years and more of a requirement, right? We need those frontline staff at those user meetings from the start. Um,
Yes.
in your opinion, and I know everyone kind of has different reasons why, but why is the clinical voice in design so important from the start of a project?
Um, and nothing against the administrators. I don't want to, I don't want to because usually the administrators have come from a long line of clinical work. They've, promoted up and have a great deal of knowledge, but they lose touch with boots on the ground.
Mhm.
And I always like to be sure that we have a contingent of voices from boots on the ground because the administrators, they deal with a heavy load on the administrative end that kind of they do hear from their staff, but they kind of lose touch a little bit. And so we have to have a voice or two or three from our frontline staff just to, to get a better perspective of their day to day. It's very important. It's very important. Granted, you don't want everybody in the in the meeting. That can cause chaos, but
Absolutely.
a select few is always preferred.
Yes.
Always preferred.
And I completely appreciate it too, because having that engagement from the start, you get that buy-in for the project,
You
right?
get buy-in, they feel heard, they feel, listened to, they feel, included in the decisions. And one of the challenges is if you have three people in the meeting, you have six opinions. So, everybody is kind of all over the place. So it's hard to corral sometimes, but at some point we reach a consensus. We have to. We set a deadline. This design period is from A to B, and when we reach B, we all have to agree one way or the other. And then we go to the next phase, and we do, the next phase. So we did reach a consensus eventually, but it's really important to have, even though there's little chaos, it's important to have their voices in the mix.
Yeah, I really think having multiple eyes on something ultimately creates a better product. But I definitely agree. You have to be selective of who it is, right?
Yes.
And you have to ensure that there's a definitive start and end for submissions of because
Yes. It can go on forever.
we can be on this design process for years. So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's very, very true. And you can't accommodate everyone.
yeah.
Someone's going to have to compromise. There's going to have to be compromise all the way around. And because this is a physical space, it's not a conceptual space. You have to build it, and it has to comply with agency and code requirements, a lot of agency and code requirements, and it has to be functional. And that's what I think personally the magic is with what people in our positions do, and our designers, architects, engineers. It's like magic. It goes from a piece of paper and lines on a piece of paper to a functioning, working place that people, when you think about surgery and people who are sick and recovering, on the positive side, having babies, oh my goodness, it's really amazing. It's just, yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I just had surgery, so again, so I'm recovering as well. So it's amazing.
You get to reap the benefits, but I definitely agree. This type of project work, there's a tangible outcome, right? A physical
Yes.
space that you get to be in at the end, which is very rewarding for
It
those.
is very rewarding. It is very rewarding. I have to admit. Yes. Yes.
So we live in a very regulated state, so licensing is not something unfamiliar to us. But licensing the lab is a whole different ballgame. And we talked about the lead time, but other regulatory bodies that you're dealing with on top of, the Department of Health, like CLIA and CAP.
Yeah.
So can you share your approach to licensing a lab and how it's different from a patient care environment?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I'm not the frontline person for licensing. I assist. I do whatever they need, but I'm not the frontline. I'm not the frontline person interacting with all the agency representatives. But yes, so the lab is within a hospital, or if it's a standalone, it still has to meet CDPH requirements. It also has to meet, and it can meet OSHPD or HCI requirements, OSHPD 3, which is a little bit of a gray zone. And one of the things I'm learning painfully with project after project is sometimes one agency, it does not align with another. And to meet one agency's requirement, I won't go into details about what these requirements that we're running into, but sometimes you meet one and it's opposite to what the other. So you end up accommodating both. So you're trying to, and sometimes you're trying to accommodate something that's not clearly defined, but you're just trying to, because it's a little gray. And we run into that a lot. But for CLIA, which is the Clinical Lab Improvement Amendment, which ensures that the lab is putting out reliable results in a safe and timely manner. CAP is the College of American Pathologists, and they actually piggyback a bit on CLIA, although CAP, I believe, is older. CLIA actually came around in the late 1980s. CAP was around before that. And CAP will send out certification sort of tests. You'll get a CAP survey, which is actually a series of unknown specimens, but you have to identify and send the results back. I mean, it's a practicum. It's like being in a lab in school, and you're given an unknown and you have to identify it and send it back. You have to pass the test. And the test is, here's an organism, what is it? And what's its sensitivity pattern, or what is it, or what's its RNA sequence or DNA sequence, or whatever it is they're asking for. You have to provide that information back to them to maintain your CAP certification. And CLIA also does inspecting. So it's two additional agencies as well as CDPH. And again, I'm not the expert. I'm not the one that fills out all the paperwork and interacts with all the agencies, but it can be very complex and very time consuming. And again, sometimes they counter each other. They're not always on the same page.
I raise your sometimes and say there's almost always there's some sort of, wait a second, this says one thing and this one says the other. So we agree with Adrienne in the fact that I think Jeff from our team says you got to know enough to be dangerous, but team that helps us navigate those gray areas, because there is so much and that needs to happen. So.
Right. It's really tough because I think one of the, on a particular project, there was a gray area with OSHPD and CDPH. In fact, the one we just finished, the pediatric unit, treatment center, treatment room versus exam room. And OSHPD said, one said either or, but CDPH Title 22 said and I'm like, can we please get on the same page? Can we? So we had to backtrack and fix that. But the point is, if they both said the same thing, we would have covered both agency requirements. So it's extremely frustrating. And yeah, you're constantly trying to line them up and making sure where there's a gap, you just accommodate both. And that is actually costly. We're trying to accommodate all these different agencies, and sometimes we're kind of over designing to meet their requirement because you're doubling up on things that can be used for multiple things, and it is what it is. But so I'm running into that on this lab project as well. And I think what's most great, I mentioned gray areas, is making this lab OSHPD 3, HCI 3. They actually haven't changed the name. But I think what's interesting is OSHPD 3 applies to a facility that has outpatient activities. Well, a clinical lab really doesn't have the patient, you have the patient samples. But CDPH won't come in and license the building unless it's OSHPD 3. But OSHPD 3 is really for clinics with people, not clinics with specimens. And so you're trying to accommodate this requirement that goes above and beyond what you really need so you can get your CDPH licensing. It's really, I want them to get their act together. Come on, guys, and fix that.
Please.
Yeah. So go ahead.
You certainly have worked on your fair share of activation projects, and I know there's different phases. There's initiation, we're bringing everyone together. There's, the transition where we're doing the task list, which everyone is loves to hate. And then there's activation. Do you have a favorite phase of the project? And if you do, what is it and why?
I love the dress rehearsals. I think they're amazing. It's like kicking the tires,
Yeah.
Everyone can go in and, push the buttons and turn on the lights and operate chairs or operate equipment that, that may be in the space. And then we generate a list and we fix it, because there's nothing worse than trying to go in and fix something once a patient is in the space. So I love the dress rehearsals. I think they're great. So I think that's my favorite part. Yeah.
We love the dress rehearsals too. And I do think I often reflect on the fact that if you didn't do a dress rehearsal, how would you find out all these issues existed? You
Right.
do patients there.
Yes.
And that would be true, in my opinion, because to your point, it's so hard to fix things once operations has begun in a space.
Right.
When no one's there. So
yes.
we love dress rehearsal too.
Yeah.
So we're to a final point.
Okay.
Someone started their career, maybe thinking about making a career jump, similar to what you did, Adrienne. What would your advice? How do you even get into transition, facilities, planning, design? What would be your advice?
Wow. I just kind of fell into all of this. It just kind of unfolded. It wasn't really a plan to end up where I am. It just kind of happened. But I think if you're looking for something new, you're looking for something different, do your research. Seek out people who do this or are in the periphery of in the realm that you're interested in. Take a few classes. Before I ended up taking, it's kind of funny because I always was taking classes. As I think back, I was taking computer programming classes when I was working in the lab. And then I did at one point I thought I was going to start knocking off vintage clothing, and I took pattern making because I love to sew. I took pattern making, went out to Caltech and took the pattern making, and I was going to, partner up with one of my other technologist friends who has since unfortunately passed away, but we were going to knock off vintage clothes. So you take some classes, you talk to people, you see if you like it or not. I think the best thing to do is just do your research. And then if you've decided to make it happen, get your financial ducks in a row. I spent 4 years. I worked weekends and all summers in the lab while I was in graduate school. I did not work in the architecture firms because I was an adult and I needed adult pay. So happy to be honest. But I managed to keep my house and keep my car note. And I worked weekends in the lab and was a full-time student Monday through Friday. So I just, make sure your financial situation is it's straight, because the last thing you want to do, if you're moving from an established career and trying to make that transition, the last thing you need is financial issues. I did the Stafford loan. It took me 20 years to pay it off, but I did it. So just make sure your financial situation is intact before you make that transition. If it's going to be a sacrifice as far as income is concerned, make sure you got it covered. Get the loan if you have to get the loan. You pay it off eventually. So.
I 100% agree. That is good advice. I myself went to graduate school later in life. And that was definitely one of the decision points was, for this, what's the impact to my family? Um,
Mhm.
Sustainability. You're going to work full time because you're an adult and you have adult commitments.
Yeah,
So mental health impact for us. So that's really great advice that I think everyone should take note of and research
absolutely.
for important. Um,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And get your priorities straight. It's funny because I went through a period where I would call my gardener to cut the lawn as needed. Before I went back to school, he was there every 2 weeks or whatever the arrangement was. And at one point, I just held him off to the point where my neighbors started to pass around a petition. I mean, it's all fine now, of course, but at that time, I'm like, okay, look, give me a minute here. I'm a graduate student and I'm trying to make a lot of things happen. So, you have to consider your neighbors too sometimes, depending on the situation.
yeah, but priorities, right? The Starbucks,
Right.
what can I put off? So
Yes.
I do believe continuous education is so important. I love to continue to take classes because I think if we're not learning, we're not growing.
That's
And
true.
definitely reach out to different industries because even if it's not something you're going to do, it certainly can benefit you. I'm sure that that course you took, now when you're looking at different designs for the hospital, you have that eye that was perhaps, not refined before. So very good.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Well, I did warn you, we like to end all our episodes with a rapid fire.
Okay. Okay.
Listeners and
Okay.
know you. And we also like to have Yellow Brick. We like to have some fun. So, what do you say?
Okay. Sure.
All right. First question: favorite place in Los Angeles?
Oh, in Los Angeles, I'm a big fan of Manhattan and Redondo and Hermosa Beach. Those are my favorite places to hang out. So
Oh,
even though it's not Los Angeles, I'm a big Manhattan Beach fan.
I feel
Yeah.
like it's in Los Angeles area. So
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
very
Yeah.
all right. This is play into your architecture. City slash place is have your favorite style architecture in the world.
Well, that's interesting. Um, hmm. I haven't seen as much as I'd like. I really enjoy Paris, but I've become a real nut for the Netherlands, and I love Amsterdam. And the canal homes are quite fun. So yeah, and that's something I've personally been able to experience. So I do enjoy a lot of European design. So yeah,
Very nice.
yeah.
Okay, you're stressed out and you need a snack, sweet or salty?
Salted caramel and chocolate. It's both.
Yeah, hey, I love salted caramel. It's delicious.
It's a little bit of both. So yeah, but if I'm not stressed out, yeah.
Sea salt. I love sea salt on any. So,
Yes.
all right. We're approaching the holiday season. Do you have a favorite tradition?
As an adult, as a kid, it was always the Christmas tree and the whole 9 yards. And as a young adult, I started hosting the family. Now I really enjoy just the family dinner. The family dinner and everybody getting together and either we're all preparing it together in one place, or we all bring a dish in. I just having that communion with family is for me as an adult. You know, the tree and everything. We're not doing that anymore. We're all adults now. We don't need that anymore. But
Yeah,
yeah, just the communion among family and friends, I think is important to me.
I agree.
Yeah.
Vacation destination that you haven't been to.
Wow. Just recently I've been talking about Costa Rica. I want to see Costa Rica. Everybody keeps talking about it. So I was contemplating in this coming March. It's not a dead conversation yet, but it's a possibility.
Hey, I'm sure Kelly would be excited to go. So you should tell her. She's always going to some place like that. So that sounds
Yeah.
very nice.
Yeah.
We're also approaching goal setting season. So In 2023, I am going to,
Oh, me?
yep,
A goal for 2023?
yep,
I just had knee replacement surgery, and now both knees are bionic. I'd like to get better shape. I have to be realistic about my expectations. I am a senior, so I know I'm not going to get into details about age, but I would like to get into better shape. So I think that would be a goal. I had stopped riding my bike on the beach. That's one of the reasons why I enjoy Redondo. I would take my bike down and get on the bike path and ride all the way down to Redondo Beach and right up to the pier. I want to go back to doing that. I think that's a reasonable, achievable goal.
just for everything, stress, all of that. So that's
Yes.
very, very nice. All right,
Yes.
last one. We're our questions for the holidays.
Mm.
I'm most thankful for.
What am I most thankful for? Wow. So, yeah. So I personally, family is going through a bit of a challenge. My mom is not well, and I'm handling all of her affairs. And I think I'm thankful for being able to actually handle her affairs. It's been a lot.
Yeah,
And I'm thankful that financially, we've been able to get her the care that she needs. And I have the capacity um, to handle it. It's been a lot. So I am very thankful for that because it could be much worse. Oof. Yeah, she has Alzheimer's. So it's a tough one. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is has you, and we know how much she needs. So definitely thankful for family and the ability to be there for them. I think that is something all of us should be very grateful for every
Yeah.
year.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Adrienne, that took us to the end. Thank you for your time today. And listeners, if you want to know a little bit more, have interesting questions for Adrienne, feel free to message me on LinkedIn or reach out to me. And we certainly will make sure to get you those answers back. And anything else you want to share with our listeners, Adrienne, before we let you go?
I just want to thank you for thinking of me and including me in this podcast. This is actually the first time I've been involved in a podcast. So thank you for considering me and listening to my story. And you know, I always think it's interesting, but I never think anybody else thinks it's interesting. So I appreciate that.
We love you, Adrienne. Community. So we thank you because despite not being in podcast, you certainly have done your fair share of presentations. So we understand how busy you are. So we appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.
On the next episode, as always, we'll have another leader within the healthcare industry to share their best practices, lessons learned, and insights. And listeners, if you want to hear more episodes like this, please consider following us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast. And remember, we have a YouTube channel too. So if you want to see this conversation, check out our YouTube and like and subscribe. Until next time, listeners, cheers.
Cheers.